I worked as a park ranger for 10 years. For a long time I told myself the things I saw were accidents, bad luck, the kind of stories you end up inventing to fill the cold nights on lonely roads. I stopped telling myself that the night they brought Samuel Parker in on a blanket, and there was no face, only a small hand laid on the stretcher like an offering. Who would believe a ranger who says the forest keeps its own rules, who names the thing that takes people, and calls it by a human name? I kept my mouth shut because the forest is a place where silence is a kind of currency. You learn when to spend it. You learn who will speak and what speaking means. For me, silence was survival. For others it was conspiracy, or cowardice, or the easier lie. Now that I don't work there anymore, now that I'm far enough away that the cedar scent doesn't seep under my skin at all hours, I can say the words out loud. Strange things are happening in Washington's forests. They happened where I stood watch for years. They started as small, impossible things and then grew teeth. And when I tried to tell those in charge, when I asked for help, they told me to forget. If you think this is just another missing hiker story, stay with me. I have photographs. I have reports that were filed and later scrubbed clean. You will hear names that do not belong in any official document, and you will hear a number that haunted me until it gave me insomnia. 317. Keep listening. I was in the northeast quadrant that morning, in the kind of wet fog that turns everything into a charcoal drawing. Samuel Parker was 5 years old. His parents flagged down the trailhead volunteer with a trembling voice and said the kid had wandered off while they were at a picnic spot near Hurricane Ridge. We ran the grid like we always did. Lines of boots, radios spitting static, breath visible in front of our faces. The woods had a hush that day, the kind that makes your own radio sound like a betrayal. I remember the damp on my gloves, the way my torch picked up only the sheen of wet bark and nothing human. We found him at 3:17 in the afternoon, 5 hours after his parents reported him. Not the boy himself, no more than a suggestion, a small dark shape in the ferns, just a man slumped against a cedar with his head turned away, his clothes torn in ways that made my stomach drop. Paramedics Emily and Thomas worked the scene with the professional distance of people who had trained themselves to do the hardest things without letting the sound of them in. They covered the man's face with a jacket and moved on to the child. I will not describe the details of what the child looked like. What I will say is this. There was an element to that scene that did not fit anything biological I had been trained to interpret. There was a single pale hand laid on a small blanket at the edge of the tarp, fingers splayed like someone trying to remember a name. Emily's hands trembled when she lifted it. Thomas swore once under his breath and didn't do it again. Peterson, the forensic tech, took photos and bagged what he had, but later he would give me a look that said, without words, that the evidence did not behave the way evidence was supposed to. When a thing goes missing, and I mean really missing, not lost pack or slipped phone, you expect a procedural chain. Reports, search efforts, press. What you don't expect is the way the institution smooths over the jagged parts. Chief David Roberts came down in his soft suit and softer voice and said the right words. We'll do everything we can. Then he walked through the scene and into a trailer and told us to limit statements. He told the family to cooperate, to believe the process. He told me plainly to keep things internal. There is a language for that. Operational security. Avoid speculation. A language made to kill stories quietly. Later that night, when the floodlights had been taken down and the search teams had dispersed, something else happened that marked the place in my head. A single black balloon was found tangled in the lower branches of a cedar, the ribbon dangling like a tongue. It was out of season and wrong in a million small ways. Its surface had a film of muck and dew. Fingerprints smudged the latex like a thumbprint someone had tried to erase. At the base of the tree there were prints, barefoot, too small to be an adult's, and arranged in a pattern I couldn't place at first. They led to the man and stopped. We photographed the balloon. I took a picture with my phone because in those hours you start to hoard proof like firewood. In the morning the photos looked wrong. The balloon was blurred as if the camera couldn't hold its outline. More than that, when I showed the prints to Peterson during evidence intake, he glanced at my phone and said, "There's nothing in that frame. Only leaves." The image on my screen played like a slide with one frame missing. I pressed the photo, zoomed in, and there was an emptiness where the thing had been tangled among branches. Peterson told me there were processing flags in the lab, artifacting, and he said not to worry, that compression in low light could do this. But Peterson also kept things. He put a piece of that ribbon in a zip bag with his initials, folded small and precise. I saw it later in his locker when he thought no one was watching. That was my first real taste of the way evidence could leak away. It wasn't just the balloon. Later, photographs of a picnic table, our initial suspect area, showed 4 people sitting, a family mid-meal. I took a panorama from the ridge above because light was good that day. When Prince came back from the lab, the family was not there. The table showed only plates and a smear of coffee, an empty parking spot and an empty blanket. I kept the original file on my camera. When I turned it up, those people were there, laughing and alive. When I passed the memory card to Peterson, his hands hovered a fraction of an inch above my thumb, and he said, "Those frames are corrupted." He never showed me the originals he kept. James Miller was 27, had the sort of jaw that lined up with his words. He was my partner for a shift after the Samuel Parker case, assigned because David wanted 2 people on that trail for the next week. James had been a volunteer guide at first, then hired on the spot because he knew the region. He'd spent summers camped along the Sol Duke and winters in the ranger office learning to be polite to tourists his way. He liked to whist lewd sea shanties under his breath, and he carried a pocket knife with a worn notch in the handle. He laughed easily, which made him both a good partner and vulnerable in a place that takes joy for a stranger. We walked the ridgeline the night James joined my shift. The fog moved through the trees like slow breath. He told me about the time a group of students had tried to spend a night in the grove and came back pale and refusing to speak of it. He said that night like it was a stupid ghost story. I believed him. I wanted to believe him, because the alternative is to put your hands on the thing and feel how cold it is. We found the barefoot prints the next day, a neat line of small impressions that crossed a clearing and disappeared into a circle of deer tracks. I counted 13. We have rules about counting signs. Measure everything, make a map, label with GPS, so I did. The prints stopped at exactly 13 paces around an old stump. There was no blood, no hair, no jewelry, nothing matching Samuel's clothes. But the circle felt deliberate, like someone had set the deer there as if arranging guests at a table. James joked that someone had a very weird idea of rustic theater. His laugh that day had an edge. He started to take the forest less as an environment and more like a room with furniture that could be moved. That afternoon we followed faint tracks that led to a place where the trees were thinner and the river sang louder. We saw a picnic blanket with 4 plates but no people. I raised my camera and took a few shots, expecting to document the strangeness and hand them up the chain. When I flipped through the playback, there was only fabric, sea salt stains and nothing else. I kept the camera to my face and felt the air like it was someone holding my throat. James's smile vanished. 2 nights later, he was on the radio at a 104, checking in from a ridge I had told him not to climb alone. "Echo team, this is Miller." Static, then a crackle. "Beacon 9-5, I'm..." And then the squawk of lost signal. We pinged his position, triangulated, sent the grid. When we reached the spot he had described, there was nothing. No camp, no sleeping bag, only a hat left on the trail, face down as if whoever had worn it had stood up and been swept away. The radio lay on a mossed log, turned off. The frequencies were clean. We combed every meter. We called it in. Chief Roberts lowered his voice and asked for patience. "He could have gone off map," he suggested. "Hikers, other teams, miscommunication." The search expanded. Volunteers from town walked lines for days and days, the forest growing familiar with shoes, until the prints themselves seemed like artifacts from somebody else's life. I took a photograph at the spot where James's hat had been. In the frame you could see the hat, the radio, a shoe print, a single boot tread heading away. I handed that card to Peterson and watched him look at it under fluorescent light. He swore, and then he looked at me with the small, careful pity one reserves for those who won't accept what's safe to accept. "The boot print's incomplete," he said. "It ends abruptly. The soil composition shows a void. I can note it, but it's not conclusive." That was bureaucratese for, we have no proof we can use to keep the press interested. The press had already started rumor threads. The families were calmer if there was a narrative, if their loved one fell, if there was a bad actor, if there was a medical cause. An inexplicable absence is an accusation. The agency did not want to be accused. When James vanished, the name Michael Sullivan began to appear in the mouths of men I had trusted. I heard it first in whispers, half jokes about a mythical park worker who never took leave. Then I heard it from Jack Thompson, a man older than the pines who had been a ranger longer than I had been alive. We were alone by a wood stove in the trailer, the kind of heat that makes small sounds magnified. Jack had more scars than stories, but he had reached the point where stories were a kind of medicine. "You ever hear of Sullivan?" Jack asked, not looking at me. "No," I said, honest. "Don't be clever. We used to call him the anti-ranger," Jack said. "Name's older than me. The name that gets whispered when someone goes missing. When evidence disappears. Don't go chasing that. Don't touch a ladder if you see one." He tapped his mug with his knuckle. "Rules," he said. "There are rules." Mark Riffs, who had a way of smiling like everything was under control, told me later that the name had 100 faces. "Some say he was a man who went mad in '56, Mark said. "Some say 37. Old incident reports with the header wiped out. We have them in the back, if you know where to look." He held up a finger like a conspirator. "But don't go looking in the wrong places. It doesn't like being watched." That was the strangest thing. The way the people who had the most to lose were the ones who wanted the truth kept under a key. You could almost name their reasons: public panic, lawsuits, land value, the park as a brand, David's soft suit and softer voice. But there was more to it. There was a fear like a muscle that tightened when we spoke of certain things, a visceral recoil. I began to look at old files in the quiet hours, the way a trespasser peeks through attic windows. There were incident logs from the decades, the petty thefts, the lost hikers, the sudden animal kill reports. 2 files had the same odd header I had seen in Peterson's cramped handwriting: unclassified, subject anomaly. One from 1937 described a series of missing persons around an area labeled with a nursery rhyme I couldn't place. A 1956 report was shorter. Witnesses reported a ladder leading skyward from a dike. Multiple civilian accounts of figures turned to dust when photographed. The words were elliptical, like someone had scribbled around the edges to avoid saying too much. The older records mentioned deer arranged in unnatural patterns, circles of 13, reference to play, and a ladder specified as 13 rungs. There was a consistent timestamp appearing across the files, 3:17. Sometimes it was AM, sometimes PM, sometimes simply recorded as 0317. It was as if some inner clock in the park clicked at that same minute and the air itself shifted. I started sleeping less. Your body will do that when you have seen a pattern that makes no sense but keeps repeating like a faulty beat. My dreams were full of wood smoke that never reached my nose and a ladder appearing in the fog, its rungs made of something like aged bone and pine. I would climb and halfway up feel a name touch my tongue, a name that wasn't mine to speak. The ladder called, and in my dream the sky above it was a slow appliance hum, the kind you hear in abandoned refrigerators. In the dream I would always stop at the 12th rung because something cold pressed against my calf, and the air changed, and the forest held its breath. I woke sweating at 3:17. I took to bringing a notebook on shifts, something to write in when the quiet got too hungry. I wrote coordinates, little sketches, times. The notebook filled with things that made no sense to my training, descriptions of tactile emptiness, of faces that eroded when you blinked, of photos that showed one thing to the human eye and another when developed. The first time I showed one of those pages to Peterson, he nodded almost sleepily and said, "Keep a record. It helps when you can't remember." His expression meant something else. He knew how memory frays when the world tries to take things back. One night I visited a family's home off duty. They had a shrine of sorts, a child's backpack hung by the door, a hand-drawn dinosaur taped to the wall. The mother kept telling herself small truths. "He loved mud pies," she said. "He loved trucks." I wanted to tell her the forest had a thirst. I wanted to tell her that a name, Michael Sullivan, could be an answer or a curse. I wanted to say that evidence could be tender, and then vanish because the thing in the woods did not respect our categories of proof. Instead, I left with a photograph of a cedar tree my trembling hands had taken and put it in my pocket like a talisman. There was a pattern to the disappearances if you wanted to see one. They clustered near creek beds and old trail junctions, in places where people paused to rest and lower their guard. They happened in the kind of weather that made the world soft-edged. They happened often at 3:17. They left behind small tokens, a balloon, a shoe, a child's drawing, a hat. Or they left nothing at all. They left witnesses who could not remember the shape of what they'd seen, and always, people with authority tried to tidy the edges. In the records, I found a reference to the ladder described as a wooden thing, not always the same wood, sometimes thin, sometimes thick as a railroad tie. One file had a sketch, 13 rungs. Another had a single word in the margin, museum, and nothing else. The language felt like someone trying to avoid naming a room. The museum was mentioned as a place where objects were arranged, where the taken were preserved as exhibits. It sounded like nonsense until you met the things that could be called exhibits, and realized the mind's instinct to preserve is universal. My colleagues split into two camps, whether they admitted it or not. Some believed there was a rational explanation for all of this: misplaced items, coordinated hoaxes, the power of rumor. Others treated the forest as if it had a mind and a set of rules. Mark and Jack leaned toward the second view but were practical about it. "You don't poke a badger," Mark would say. "Sometimes you close the lid and leave it be." David Roberts and his staff leaned the other way, needing reasons that fit into forms, that could be filed and stamped and boxed. That difference in posture is what makes the difference between a story that survives and one that gets buried. I tried to pull allies into an investigation. I heard confessions in back rooms, Peterson telling of items missing from evidence bags, Emily and Thomas saying they had moved certain things to avoid upsetting families. A paramedic, Thomas, admitted once with a look of someone who had been terrified into compassion that he had seen a man who spoke of ladder and laughed, a sound that was not friendly. When I asked specifics, they averted their eyes. They knew something short and sharp. Telling made them complicit. One afternoon at the records room, I found a stack of old newspapers bound with string. The headlines read like any local paper: "Hiker found dead. Mysterious disappearance baffles searchers." Between the yellowed pages, I found notes in a thin pencil about a man called Michael Sullivan, annotations, scooped-out margins, a child's handwriting that spelled ladder twice. There were photographs, black and white. A child posed with a wooden ladder lying in the grass like a toy. The back of that picture had handwriting: "Do not trace. Leave as is." The caution suggested someone had been trying to maintain a boundary inside the archive itself. It was Jack who first told me what the word player meant in their older parlance. "You're either a player or you get played," he said, the way someone might say, "You either join or you watch." The game was something they didn't speak of at the office, but in the damp corners of their cigarettes and the long pauses between replies, the metaphor made sense. There were rules, distasteful and absolute. You belonged to the forest in a way you didn't belong to your supervisor. You could not touch certain things, ladders, knots of deer basking in circles. If you did, something changed. If you resisted, you made an enemy. The first time I heard the voice, not the voice of a man, not entirely, I thought it was wind. It was a whisper folded into the sound of the river, a dialect of static that when you paused long enough felt like language. It said a name. My throat closed when I found James's radio further along the trail, crushed under a pile of cedar needles, but the battery still warm. When I turned it on, there was nothing but a low hum, and then, for one thin second, my own voice from earlier in the walk calling out. It was as if the forest had taken the recording and rewound it, played it back at a lower pitch. I had the childish impression that something was testing me, seeing if I would notice. That night things came to a head in a small way. I'd been keeping a small carved ladder in my locker, the kind of thing rangers pass around that is meant to be a joke. Someone carved it at a camp and left it as a charm. I had taken it and rubbed at it when I couldn't sleep. The carving had 13 tiny notches, and at some point I noticed, with a kind of animal dread, that the notches matched the counting I'd been doing in my head the past few nights. I took it out and placed it on my palm and felt dizzy, like standing and finding you are taller than you remember. Word came down from Roberts to scale back search operations. "We have to focus resources elsewhere," he said over a conference call. He spoke in the measured cadences of people trained in public safety, but his eyes slid over me and rested like a weight. He suggested a volunteer closure, an appeal for public calm. He didn't mention James's hat that had been found, or the fact that my camera had captured something that would later lose itself in the lab's processing. He suggested patience. Then he said quietly, "Don't escalate. Where does a man go when the people who run the place he loved tell him to mute what his eyes have seen?" I started taking off-duty trips to the files room after everyone left, to Mark Riffs's garage where he kept notes in a shoebox he refused to catalog. Mark had under his bed a journal filled with dates and names and things he had seen. He let me read. He let me touch the paper as if it were a relic. In the margin of one page, someone had written, 317, ladder, do not climb, and drawn a crude ladder that looked too much like the one I held in my palm. I began to piece together the same names across decades, people who had vanished quietly, people who had left letters with sentences cut out. There were references to the museum, to exhibits, to players. In a margin, someone had scrawled, "He knows names. Don't let him know yours." The scrawl ended with a smear. By the time I had gathered enough breadcrumbs to be deluded into thinking I had a trail, my nights were hollowed out. I would fall asleep for an hour at the truck stop and wake with cedar scent under my tongue. My hands shook when I keyed radios. I found myself walking sections of trail alone when I should have been at the desk filing routine incident reports. I convinced myself I was doing due diligence. I told myself I was being responsible. The last thing that happened before I reached for the ladder was small and stupid and human. A mother at a trailhead handed me a child's lost glove and said, "You watch over these woods, right? Make sure nothing takes my kids." She didn't know what she was asking of me, or maybe she did, and the request was as old as civilization. Watch our children. I put the glove in my pocket and looked out over the trail like a sentinel. That night I dreamed again of a ladder. I climbed, counting rungs, feeling a number tighten in the muscles of my forearm. On the 12th rung, a voice said a single thing. "Players climb." I woke, gasping. My phone screen said, 317. I had a plan then, stupid and sharp. Find the ladder. I wasn't going to climb it at first. I wanted to see it, to take a photograph, to hold an object in my hand that could be put under glass and passed up the chain. I wanted to have something they couldn't dismiss as a corrupted file. I told myself it was method, investigation. I told myself it was for James and Samuel and the other ghosts that had begun to haunt the corners of my shifts. I packed light. Rope, a headlamp, my camera, the little carved ladder for luck or as a test. I drove past closed gates and into service roads that wind into the bones of the park. The fog sat heavy like a lid. The GPS pinged, but the trails looped in a way that felt intentional, as if designed to confuse people who weren't meant to be there. I pressed on. At the edge of a meadow where the trees opened to let the sky breathe, I saw something odd in the distance. A line of deer, 13 of them, arranged in a near-perfect circle around an old stump. They didn't flee when I raised the camera. They blinked, slow and patient. I stepped closer and my boots sank in dew. The air tasted metallic. I stopped at the edge of their ring and listened. Nothing happened. The deer went about the deer business of chewing and blinking like their lives were unbothered by human panic. I turned to photograph them, and the camera showed only the meadow and the stump. The deer were not in the frame, though I could see them with my eyes. My hands were steady, but my breath had become a thing caught at the top of my lungs. The carved ladder was cold in my pocket. I fumbled it out and set it on the stump, marking the center of the ring. For an instant it seemed to sink a fraction of an inch into the wood as if the stump recognized it. Then nothing. I put the ladder back in my pocket, and the deer looked up as a group, and then walked away into the trees like a procession leaving a church. When I got back to the truck, I found a message on my voicemail from Chief Roberts. "Wilson, come by office, and leave your camera with Peterson for evidence processing." He spoke in a way that did not allow for debate. I drove in silence with the carved ladder like a stone in my pocket. The park was a place that advised you how to behave. It had an etiquette of silence. They suspended me a week later. Officially, it was for procedural deviation and unauthorized field reconnaissance. Unofficially, the story passed through the office, in the kind of whispers built to go nowhere. James's disappearance became a footnote in the local paper, and then a memory. Samuel Parker's family left the area. Peterson stopped returning calls, but his locker smelled the same. I left the park because I was given a letter and instructions, and because the man who ran the place didn't want to see me around anymore. Before I walked out, Jack held my hand in both of his and said, "If you go, don't say the name in public. They can't hear you that way." They couldn't hear me, not the way the thing needed to be heard. When you say a name aloud in that quiet, it rebounds off trunks and falls back like a thrown stone. You can say the name, and it will change nothing. It will sit in the air, and you will feel ridiculous and small. That was where this part of the story stops. With me out of uniform and holding relics I shouldn't have taken, a small carved ladder, a scrap of ribbon that may or may not have matched the balloon, and a photograph that sometimes, if I let the light hit it a certain way, shows a child sitting at a picnic table. The photograph is not consistent. It is not reliable. It will sometimes show only empty space. But when it shows the child is smiling. I keep it in a drawer with a padlock. The thing I want you to take away from what I've told you so far is less about the specifics of any single disappearance and more about the shape of disbelief. I was trained to observe and report. I took photographs and logged coordinates. I filed evidence. All of that became ambiguous, riddled with the odd and the impossible. When I tried to put my findings into the channels that should have protected us, those channels closed. I want to tell this because somewhere along the way, keeping quiet felt like complicity. I could have continued to be part of the story that the park wanted to sell, safe, managed, boxed. Instead, I found myself a man who could not sleep and who counted to 13 in his head because patterns have a way of repeating until you notice. The name Michael Sullivan was no longer a joke. It had teeth. There is more to tell. There are files older than I have space for, things I dug out of cardboard boxes and found wrapped in cloth. There are people who tried to help and paid with careers, and the slow erosion of reputation. There are nights I watched the sky twitch and saw the ladder like a faint ladder of light leaning against the trees. There are rules I learned the hard way, the kind carved into the bone by people who didn't want to pass on their lessons. Don't touch a ladder. Don't count to 13 out loud. If you hear your own voice on the radio, unplug it before it answers. I am telling you this now because whatever it is that plays in those woods has not stopped. It keeps working in patterns like a clockmaker, with a cruel sense of humor. People still go into those forests and come back changed. People still lose things and find them somewhere else. Evidence is fluid. Photographs lie. Names whisper through the trees. I have to be honest. Part of me wants you to disbelieve. Belief has a cost. If you choose to believe me, you will notice details in the woods you never noticed before. You will hear silence as dangerous. You will count to 13 for no reason and feel foolish. If you choose not to believe, that's safer for you. It used to be easier for me to maintain that safety. It is harder now. The next steps are the ones I almost didn't take. I started following coordinates from an old, brittle map tucked behind a file labeled Miscellaneous. There were marks there that did not correspond to any trail on modern maps. I scribbled them into my notebook and drove back to the park on a service pass I had no right to use. That night the sky was full of stars, and the road back into the heart of the park felt like a vein leading into bone. I parked and locked the truck and shouldered a pack, the carved ladder pressing against my spine like a promise. When I crossed the boundary line, an imaginary thing between maintained trail and the wild that tracks don't respect, I felt the air change. Your skin knows these things before your brain catches up. The smell of sap tightened. The silence settled like a lid. I walked toward a clearing the old maps swore existed, and the spiderweb of human maps refused to mark. My headlamp cut a path through fog so thick it made halos of the low branches. Every step felt like a theft. At the clearing there was something that wasn't there in any official report. A ladder, leaning at an angle like a broken thought against the lowest branch of a cedar. It had 13 rungs. It was, impossibly, both new and ancient. The wood smelling like rain and something older. Cloth, maybe, or teeth. The carved ladder in my pocket felt like a child's version of it, a token that now seemed terrible to hold. The thing about seeing the ladder is that seeing it doesn't answer a single question. It asks more. The air around it felt too cold. My fingers went numb when I reached for the first rung. I knelt and traced it with the pad of my thumb. The wood took the pressure and did not spread. It felt like touching a memory. Something moved on the far edge of the clearing. Not a deer, too awkward, too precise. A figure? My headlamp went wild. I felt my heart hammer in the way hearts do when you step into a story that is not meant for you. The thing that had been called Michael Sullivan turned, and for a moment the world was all noise. I won't tell you what it looked like right now. I won't tell you what it said. The reason is practical. I'm not ready to give those words more power. And narrative. This is where the story forks. I can tell you how I tied a rope around my waist and prepared myself to climb. How I argued with the idea that going up might be the only way to understand. I can tell you how I heard my name in a voice not my own. But telling requires care, and there are consequences. What I will tell you is this. When the figure turned, when the white of its eyes met me, I recognized a shape I had seen in old photographs, a posture in the margin of an old report. I recognized the sense that the forest knew me. The ladder did not feel like a thing that belonged to me. It felt like a boundary. If someone had asked me then whether I believed in the thing, I would have said no, because belief isn't a measure taken in one moment. But if someone had asked me whether it was real, I'd have had to say yes. I left the clearing. I left the ladder standing, leaning like a question mark, and I walked back to my truck with the carved ladder heavy in my pocket and a new sound in my head. A whisper that repeated the time 3:17 and the instruction, "Players climb. Players come." The radio on my dash hissed and produced a static sound like breath. I didn't want to know what would happen next. I didn't want to know that those who tell you to keep silent do so, because sometimes silence is a barrier, and sometimes it's a door. They suspended me for what they called insubordination. They told the board their version of events. They put a report in a folder stamped with words that meant handled. James remained missing. Samuel's case closed administratively. My name was on a note that said, "Off-duty pending review." I gathered my things like a man leaving a marriage. I took the little carved ladder and the photograph that sometimes showed a child's face, and I put them in a box with a padlock. People never believe the first person who says the woods are wrong. They believe the bureaucracy, the statement, the man with a microphone. They like neatness. They like endings. So they made an ending where there was none. I moved out of my house and into an apartment that smelled of nothing. Nights are still the worst. At 3:17 a.m., my body wakes as if a clock is set in my ribs. I trace the raised grain of the carved ladder over and over, as if rubbing might remove the memory. The photograph sits under a stack of papers I pretend are important. On some days I think the whole thing was a fever dream produced by too many midnight shifts. On other days I can place my hand on the exact cedar where the ladder leaned and feel that place burn under my palm. They didn't believe me then, and they don't believe me now. People called it a breakdown, a misinterpretation, an unfortunate deviation from protocol. Some people find comfort in that explanation. I wish I could give it to them. I wish I could give it to myself. But I still wake at 3:17, and the carved ladder knocks like a nail at the edge of my sleep. There is more to come, files I have yet to publish, people who have reached out with stories of their own, a map that does not seem to be made for human hands. The man called Michael Sullivan has a museum where the lost are arranged like exhibits, if what I have been told is to be trusted. There are rules about the ladder. There are boundaries the forest guards. There are patterns that repeat like songs with missing verses. If you are still with me, know this. I am not trying to scare you for entertainment. I am telling you what happened to me and to people I knew. I am telling you because silence only preserves the thing that hides in it. If nothing else, remember that when the forest feels wrong, trust your bones. People with authority will have reasons to smooth the story. People with authority have their own incentives to keep things tidy. The woods don't care for tidy. There will be more. There will be a time when I tell you what happened the night I considered climbing the ladder, and what I felt when the figure turned. There will be reports from old decades that change everything you think you know about the place. There will be people who will step forward, and people who will close their mouths forever. But for now, that's where the story halts. Me, the carved ladder in my pocket, the photograph in my drawer, and a name, Michael Sullivan, that tastes like cordite when I say it. If you have a story like this, if you've seen a black balloon stuck in a tree or footprints that end without a body, if you've woken up at 3:17 and wondered why, you'll understand why I kept my mouth shut for a decade. You'll also know why I finally couldn't anymore. So I went back. I didn't tell you all of that to dramatize anything. I went back because once you see the ladder with your own eyes, some part of you believes a lie has to be answered by another truth. The truth I thought I could hand over as evidence turned out to be a living thing, and there was no chain of custody robust enough to contain it. I drove in on a service pass again, the carved ladder in my pocket like contraband. I didn't tell Mark or Jack. I didn't tell Peterson. I told myself I would take one look, put a pin in the map, and go home. That's not what happened. The clearing hadn't changed except for the smell. When I stepped into the ring of stumps and needles, the air felt older than the rest of the world. The ladder leaned there, 13 rungs bright with rain. The wood too clean and too wrong in a place that weather eats. There was a rhythm to the silence. No birds, nothing. But even silence has texture. This one sounded like the flat side of a bell that had forgotten how to sing. I tied the rope around my waist with the clumsy knots I'd practiced on nights when insomnia made me braid cord like an animal, doing whatever calmed it. My hands were steady, but my stomach wasn't. My camera was set in a strap around my neck. I had a headlamp and a small penknife that had belonged to my father. I told myself I wasn't climbing. I told myself I would secure the rope to a tree, test a rung, photograph everything from the ground. It was a useful lie. The first rung took my weight as if I'd placed it on a plank of common wood. The second felt like the memory of a bone. By the time I reached the 6th rung, the fog had closed like a fist. I don't remember deciding to go higher. There is always a point in these things where choice thins and some animal part of you keeps moving. I remember the way the world narrowed to the ladder and the ring of trees and the sound of the rope breathing. At the 9th rung, something brushed along the back of my neck and the air seemed to thicken. I smelled something like cigarette smoke, like old cloth and pine sap and pennies on a hot counter. There was a sound like chewing on old wood. Then there was a voice, and it wasn't a voice I'd ever heard before, but it understood the language of names. "You're far from home, Wilson," it said, and my name on its tongue was a thing folded into paper. It sounded amused and patient and bored, like a librarian finding someone trying to check out a book without a card. I froze halfway up. My fingers clenched. The rope hummed. The fog around the ladder trembled like the surface of a pond. I heard movement below me, leaves, a footstep, the faint scrape of something long and cold being dragged. The thing spoke again, softer. "Players climb," it said, as if reciting a line in a play, and I understood then that the ladder wasn't merely a way up. It was an invitation, a ritual, a rule that both bound and unbound people. I climbed. When I reached the 13th rung, the forest went thin like paper. The fog peeled back and there he was. Or it was. Michael Sullivan, the 4 men had given a name to for decades. Standing below the last rung, he looked less like a man than a gap arranged into a man's shape. He was pale enough that light seemed to slough off him, his eyes like holes filled with a milky, patient light that didn't quite let rain in. The teeth when he smiled were too many and too precise. They'd been placed by someone who liked symmetry and was indifferent to pain. There was something obscene about the way he fit into the world, like a patch of wrong thread sewn into a family quilt. He smelled of damp clothes and of a page turned years ago. When he spoke my name again, it was like a key fitting. "You climbed," he said. The sound moved under my boots. It wasn't hostile exactly. It was ceremonial. Players climb. Players come. I tried to keep myself small. There's a silly pride in the belief that if you do not react, you'll be invisible. He laughed then, a sound that wasn't a laugh, and that made the trees around me lean in. "Do you know the rules, Wilson?" he asked. Do you know whose name you bring with your hands? That sound of teeth made the rope vibrate in my grip. There was an intelligence in his voice that had nothing to do with human patience. It catalogued me like an archivist turning pages. I know enough, I said, which wasn't true. I was dishonest to myself because it steadied my mouth. You take people. You put them in a... The words museum and exhibit felt small in my mouth. You keep them. He cocked his head like a gull. We make keeps, he said. We arrange. We preserve. Some come to be kept. Some are taken. The grammar made it sound like consent could fit into a place a metaphor had been trying to crawl for years. You know names, I said. You say them. Why? He stepped closer, and the world contracted to the space between us. Up close, his skin had a texture like the underside of leaves, and his eyes, those white wells, glowed with a milky hunger for things that weren't quite what he wanted to eat. He smelled of river mud and pages that had been left to mildew. A game is better with rules, he said. A game is better with players who understand their part. You know the rules. You climb, you look, you leave, or you stay. Why James? My voice was small. The rope bit my waist. Why Samuel? There was a long pause, and in that pause, the sound of the forest seemed to find its voice again. A distant gull, the murmuring of a creek like a second chorus. The man, Sullivan, smiled in a way that put an ache behind my sternum. Names are appetites, he said. Some names taste like youth. Some taste like curiosity. Some are the waiting kind. He liked ladders. He likes people who climb. He likes those who keep things. He gestured to the ladder, and his hand looked like the wind passing through a fence. Do you want to be kept, Wilson? Fear is a neat instrument. It clarifies. It can make your body obey you. I didn't want to be kept, not by a thing that catalogued names and arranged deer, and whose laughter made the fog step forward. I didn't want whatever museum meant for him. I thought of James, his laugh, his knife with the notch, the hat on the trail. I thought of the families with their shrines. I thought of Samuel's small hand, splayed like a plea. I thought of the other scars in the files and the margin notes, and the way men like Mark and Jack had tapped the table and said, "Don't climb." I did the only violent thing I could think to do. I drew the penknife my father had given me, the one with the worn handle, and I slashed at a rung. It was not graphic. It need not be. The blade met wood, and for a heartbeat I felt the same sensation I had felt when I snapped a bone as a child. A clean, unavoidable change. The rung cracked along an old seam, and in the sound that followed it frayed like a cord broken in concert. The ladder did not groan or creak like a living thing. It disintegrated in the way a memory does when you poke it too hard. Dust and splinters sifted down as if the wood had been waiting for permission. His face changed then. He who had smiled like a book in a library ruffled like a page gone missing. The calm left him in a rush. He moved faster than any man should have been able to. He lunged at me, teeth bared, and the world became a clean instrument of motion. I fell. The rope held. My harness burned my hips. I swung and hit a branch and slid, the rope howling. The dust of the ladder crumbled around me like a sigh. He reached, and his hand closed on air where a rung had been. The motion had the violence of someone who had been cut off mid-sentence. He swore, a sound like broken glass, and then he did something I had not expected. He screamed. It wasn't human. It rolled out of the forest, and the treetops trembled. The sound shook the berries on their stems, and the deer in some distance stampeded, not away from him but away from me, answering some other direction of dread I could not see. His voice, if you could call it that, banged against the trees and then became a low keening that shook the hairs along my arms. And then he ran. He ran faster than any human, as if his stride folded space. He moved like a shadow given angry movement, and the trees blurred where he passed. I swung free and came down on an old root and rolled, the knife skittering out of my hand and embedding in the moss. He was already across the clearing, running toward the tree line, his hands sweeping at the trunks as if they were curtains. I followed, unthinking, as if my body had been given the same script and couldn't refuse. The forest around the boundary, where maintained trail gave way to old growth, had a faint, almost invisible seam, a change in moss color, a line of lichen that grew a hair different on one side, the sound of birds changing from chorus to hush. Men who had worked the woods a long time could tell you where the boundary felt like a door. Those were the same men who warned you not to cross with the wrong intent. He crossed the seam and hesitated. It's a small thing to say he couldn't pass. He put his hand on a cedar, and the wood drank him up to his wrist, then pulled back as if burned. He moved forward again, and the lichen flared like a shiver. He took 2 steps that were all hunger and law, and then his motion stopped, like a film paused. He looked at me, and for the first time there was a rawness in him that was almost human. He opened his mouth to say something, and the words came out as a thin, flaring whisper. "You broke the ladder." It wasn't anger. It was grief, or something that resembled a human understanding of loss. For a long moment he simply looked at the broken space he had occupied, and then at the ground under his feet. The demarcation, where whatever rules held him permitted, and forbade his movement. He tried to step and his toes met resistance like a cold thing that pushed him back. He recoiled. He screamed again, a noise that tore something in my chest. And then he threw his hands to the trees and the fog seemed to rush in, swallowing him like a tide. He left behind a smell of wet cloth and old tobacco, and the space where he had walked felt scraped of sound. He retreated into the wood that he could still touch, and then he was gone. I did not wait to see if he would return. I had rope burns on my hands and the taste of dust in my mouth and a bloody nick on my palm from where I had grabbed the knife when the ladder shattered. I ran for the truck and drove away like a man who had stolen something he didn't understand. The next hours were the sort of immediate sequenced chaos institutions make into reports. I called the office. My voice on the radio was raw. I told them I had been at the ladder, that it had come down, that the figure, Michael Sullivan, had appeared and then retreated. Chief Roberts returned my call, or rather he had someone patch him in after a silence that felt like measurement. He told me to come in. He asked for details in a way that made me feel the floor drop under me. "We have to stabilize this," he said. "Take photographs. Hand over any evidence. We will peer review." I handed over the camera footage, and when I watched the clips later, the ladder dissolved into a kind of smear before my eyes. The frame stuttered, and then showed blank trees. My watch said the time on the footage was 3:16, and then a minute later a series of frames where a shape moved. Then nothing. Peterson took the knife and the scraps of wood and put them in a bag. He looked at me long and then looked away. "You didn't record the fall," he said. "There's a gap at 3:17. It's corrupted. We can run a recovery, but..." "But what?" I said. "These files don't like being forced," he said, and his tone was not technical anymore. It carried apology and the fatigue of a man who had seen enough impossible things to grow a muscle of quiet around them. "You'll be fine, Wilson. We'll document it. Document it." The word implied a pen and a neat stack and a box. The thing I had witnessed did not like being boxed. Word spread. The agency called a meeting. Men in tidy park suits said, "We are taking this seriously," and then followed the sentence with the action they considered serious. They limited statements, they advised us to take a leave, they hammered down the channels of rumor like nails. David Roberts spoke with a voice that blended regret and authority. He said things like procedural deviation and unauthorized contact with hazards. He said there would be an inquiry. He said gently, "We must safeguard the park's reputation." They suspended me. They accused me, in dry memos and measured sentences, of compromising operations and escalating public risk. In the office, they printed a sanitized version of the story that became a memo and then a footnote. I am not proud, but I am honest. In a climate that values order, the man who breaks internal rules often becomes the easiest scapegoat. If you walk into the machinery of bureaucracy with something that cannot be filed, the machine files you. They ran their inquiries. They interviewed Mark and Jack. They asked Peterson to testify regarding the chain of custody. Peterson stood under institutional light and told the story in the way technicians tell bad news, with precise words and a voice that tries to be useful. He said there had been corruption of digital frames and artifacting and unreliable witness testimony. He did not volunteer the ribbon in his locker. He did not mention the photograph tucked beneath his boot. He cleaned his hands of anything that would complicate the record. After a while, Peterson disappeared. Not physically, but practically. He stopped showing up on shifts. His locker sat empty for a week, and then someone else took it over. Rumors flared and died in cubicles. People said he had taken a job in forensics elsewhere. People said he had retired. People said stubborn things about corruption and personal propensities. No one said he had become afraid. Mark and Jack pulled back. They kept calling me in the evenings, their voices lower, and then their calls dwindled. Jack met me once in the dark of a diner and held my hands in both of his and told me he couldn't be part of whatever I intended to do publicly. "You started a match in a dry place, Sonny," he said. "I can't be near a fire I'm not ready to die in." I did not die. I lost something with the agency and gained something else, freedom to move, and the useless, heavy, necessary obligation to tell. I tried to go public. I contacted a local reporter, an earnest woman with a nose for oddities. She listened with an educated skepticism, and then, when I sent the footage and the photographs, she came back with questions about mental health, about stress, about the rational possibility of hoax. The footage she ran in a short piece showed a blurred smear in the trees and a few frames of static. The comments were kind and cruel both. A handful of readers called it a hoax. Many called it closed. A few reached out and said they had their own stories. That's an important part of the narrative. There are other players. I started to get messages from people who said they had been on trails at 317 and had woken shouting, who said they had photos that showed empty picnic tables where their children had been, who said they'd found ribbons of balloon in tree forks and had the memory of hands that weren't theirs brushing their hair. One woman emailed me a picture from 1989 of a family on a picnic blanket. No faces appeared on the developed image. Her father had been a ranger and had died in 2002. He had written in margins of old notebooks, "Do not trace. Let it be." The handwriting was distracted and intent, like a man scratching a warning with the hand of someone who didn't trust paper. One message came from a man who called himself Outsider, who wrote about an old treaty story his grandmother used to hum about, an oral tale of a boundary maker who kept time with ladders. He warned me to be careful with how I used names and suggested that sometimes naming a thing anchored it in a way you couldn't undo. The message had no return address. The kind of messages I received were my small consolation and my larger proof. Whatever I had seen hadn't been mine alone. Time kept doing its thing. The public file on Samuel Parker remained closed with the neatness that makes grief digestible. James kept being a footnote in a local story until the story slid into obscurity. The latter, for the public, had never existed. For men like Mark and Jack, and for Peterson, and for a handful of others, it was something they had learned to live around like a hole in the floorboards where you do not step. But my discrediting didn't stop me. It gave me odd freedoms. Without official obligations, I could talk to people who had been silenced by fear of losing their job. A woman at a bookstore in Port Townsend handed me an old typescript she said her grandfather had bound. It contained transcriptions of something that read like field notes. 1937, ladder sighting near Old Dyke. 3 missing. Photographs show table, no people. 317. There were notes in the margins in a hand that had been used to writing for years. Museum, player language, keep quiet. Someone had folded the paper around something and pressed it. When I unfolded it, there was a photograph of a child with a ladder in the background and on the back the words, "Do not bring to light." I began to map these things. Dates, locations, weather, auras of fog. The pattern grew not into a tidy line, but into a braided thing. What interested me most was the consistency of that little timestamp, 317. Sometimes it was AM, sometimes PM, sometimes written as 0317. It threaded across decades like a seam. Patterns don't explain things. They make you ask better questions. I went to a man some people in town called a keeper of stories, an elder of sorts who had spent his life listening to older voices that other people had dismissed. He was not a tribal leader I could name. He was someone who'd spent his life listening to the stories people rarely made into reports. He had an honest face and hands that had carved wood and laid nets. "I don't want you to say my name in public," he told me. because people still talked that way to avoid making things official. Names. That's how they find you. They like syllables. They count them like seeds. Keep the syllables small. What do you know? I asked. Do you know what it is? He considered me like a man checking an instrument for calibration. We had a story, he said. An old story of a thing that collects the careless, that keeps a museum of what the woods let go. We called it many names in many years. We knelt before certain trees and left offerings. We counted steps. Some things you do to remind the world you are not the only one watching. But names. Names have power. If you say it like a headline, the thing remembers your mouth. His voice grew thinner. We taught our children not to speak the ladder's name at dusk. We told them not to count to 13 aloud. Do you think it was a guardian once? I asked. A guardian turned. He smiled without humor. Guardians are stories for children. This thing kept a rhythm that people learned to live with. When someone broke the rhythm, things shifted. The land remembers. Sometimes the land decides to keep what it believes should not go. I left with his warning like a stone in my pocket. He had not told me to stop. He had simply advised carefulness. There is a difference. Guidance is a neutral thing. Advice is a conditional weapon. What I did next was perhaps inevitable. I started collecting items people had tucked away. String, old photographs, a ribbon, a child's sock, a little toy truck. I kept them in a box with a padlock because ritual matters in the world that had taken the first things I loved. The box grew into a repository of small griefs. When I opened it on certain nights and turned the items, they'd feel like relics of a world that had been molested by a language that refused to fit in the margins. The carved ladder sat on top of the pile like a small accusation. There was a night, one of many, when I received a call from someone calling himself Mark's cousin. He said Mark had found something in his garage he couldn't explain and had asked him to get rid of it. The man had a voice that shook not with age but with urgency. Don't go asking, he said. Don't go looking. Some things are better left in the dark. He used our names like talismans in the line of an exorcism, and then he hung up. I don't want to romanticize fear. Fear is functional. It pulls you back from cliffs. It keeps you alive at night. But it can also be the habit of institutions and people who'd rather close a door than open another. There was a component to the silence beyond institutional self-preservation. There was shame and craft and the human desire to make the world bearable by whittling away what could not be contained. That is not a defense of the silence. It is an explanation. Months passed. I took odd jobs, drove pieces of equipment, did things that paid the bills and did not invite the public eye. I taught myself to sleep again in fits, always waking in the same breath at 3:17. I learned the ways my body betrayed memory. The sudden tightening of my calves when I heard a ladder creak on a construction site, the way my eyes would track the outline of a child in a crowd, even if the outline had nothing to do with being lost. One autumn, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small stack of pages, brittle with whatever age gives paper, and a photograph. The pages had been typed decades ago, maybe 1956, maybe earlier, and they were notes from someone who had been doing the same thing I had been doing, mapping, counting, noting. There were references to ladder, museum, players. There was a notation that read, "If one breaks the rung, he will rage, but will be restrained at the boundary." The ladder can be burned, but it reappears. The name can be spoken to call it. The name can be sung to soothe it. We have tried both. I read that line a dozen times. It explained nothing, and it explained enough to be dangerous. The pages had been folded to include a photograph of a man standing beside a ladder, his face erased with ink. On the back, in a thin hand, someone had written, "Do not make a spectacle of this. Preserve privacy. If you cannot, burn these." Someone had instead mailed them to me. Who, I do not know. The postage was from a town I had never visited. I am telling you this because the law of the thing is not the law of logic. The ladder will not be solved by a single answer. It eats explanations and grows new ones like mold. The more people try to define it, the more it grows around the language of definition. That is part of why people kept quiet, naming it, reporting it, Making it official seemed to make it more of what it wanted. There were nights I sat with the pages and the photograph, and I felt the air tighten. I would press the little carved ladder to my palm and feel the grain of wood as if I could make it a talisman rather than an accusation. I would sleep with the padlock box under my bed. Sometimes in the drawer, I would pull out the photograph and hold it up to the light. Sometimes the child's face would be there smiling. Sometimes it would be only blotches of light. The evidence was not consistent. That inconsistency was the weapon the thing had. It made testimony unreliable. People asked me why I didn't run. Why didn't I move 2 states away, change my name, hire men to watch my back? I tried. I moved cities for a time. The insomnia came with me. 317 does not keep time for other time zones. It woke me like a scent clock. The carved ladder sat on a shelf and called. My hands would find it in the dark and rub it like a rosary, counting the 13 notches until the arithmetic of it steadied me. Sometimes, in the small hours, I would get letters or messages from others. One man wrote that as a child, his father had come home with a small wooden ladder nailed above a mantel and a story about keeping things in order. His father had died with the ladder left in the garage, and when he took it to be appraised, the ladder vanished. There were men who wrote about their wives who returned from hiking changed, silent for days, and then who refused to speak about what they had seen in the trees. Women who wrote in the voice of someone trying to keep the past small. Each message was a mirror and a bruise. I tried once in a fit of anger and hope to take the story to a national outlet. The piece I gave them was long, careful, full of timestamps and photographs and margins. The host station called me an interesting local. They wanted a soundbite, a face, a pull quote. They didn't want a catalog. They wanted a narrative that ends. The night before the segment aired, the producer called and said, "We've cleaned up the files. There's an oddity in one frame, but nothing showing anything that would cause a public alarm. We need to run with a human interest angle." They aired a segment that made me sound like a man who had loved his job and had perhaps been worn down by grief. I watched myself on television like a ghost. The public disbelief hardened as an industry of rationality does what it does best: reduce a messy thing into a pattern it understands. I could write to you pages of names of the men who told me to calm down, who told me to let grieving families go, who clipped my words into policy. It would not change the fact of what I had seen. It would not make the morning a child was found with no face less unbearable. There were a few nights, quiet ones, when I thought I had done enough. When I thought that by breaking the ladder, I'd saved someone. I allowed myself a small relief, like a splinter sliding free. It didn't last. The cycles of the thing were not linear in that way. One autumn, a man reached out on a thread I used to check in the small hours. He called himself Field Notes 37, and he posted a scan of a page I had not seen in any of the boxes, an incident report from 1937 describing a ladder and 13 deer, and the time 0317. The scan had been donated to an archive and then hidden. He had found it. The archive had been a small college in the region, its staff working quietly with old paper. He sent me the coordinates. They matched nothing on modern maps, but matched in the way a compass points, where my old map had the small X I had traced. He said, "Don't go alone if you intend to go. Some things are territorial." I went anyway. This time I did not plan for heroism. I went with equipment, a small camera, a notebook with a lock, extra rope, and a sat phone. I told one person where I was going, not for publicity, but because honesty with one person is a different thing than making a show of truth. I told Jack. He didn't come, but he sat with me in a diner and pushed a paper cup across the table until his knuckles bled. "Don't climb," he said. "If you go and come back talking about things no one can file, you'll be marked in ways you can't fight. If you go and the thing is satisfied, all will be well. If you go and it's not, you'll get hurt in ways that won't be visible in a file." He kept both hands on the cup like a man willing to embrace his own fear. We said little else. We didn't need to. He gave me a cigarette, and his eyes were older than the last time I had seen them really look at anything. At the clearing, the air was thinner than the last time. The ladder wasn't there. Or rather, there was a hollow where the ladder might have been, and a faint impression in the earth like a bruise. I found a scrap of wood dust under a stump, and for a moment let the idea that we could be free hitch itself to my ribs. Then the wind changed, and I heard something like a choir of voices in the high branches, and the 317 thing ticked like a clock in my chest. I walked the perimeter until I found it. A stump with a line scorched into the bark, like the mark someone makes to warn others. There was a small bundle of ribbon tied to a low branch. The ribbon had the same thinness as the one Peterson had put in his locker years before. I kept it. It is in my box now, folded and faded. I did not find the ladder that night, but the tracks told a story. There were marks in the mud like a dragged foot, and a series of tiny impressions that matched a child's barefoot print. They led to a place where someone, or something, had arranged items in a small circle, leaving a space like a gallery. I took photographs with a private camera, and when I later developed the film at a shop in a town far away, the prints developed as blank spaces where the circle had been. So here is what I will end with, which is not an ending, because this is a thing that resists ending. Breaking the ladder changed something. It bought us a sliver of time. The figure we called Michael Sullivan retreated from the clearing and was, for a short moment, contained by whatever rules hold him to the boundary. He could not, at least that I saw, step past certain lines. That has rules and consequences. It means that we, who live on this side of the boundary, must guard those seams and be more watchful. It also means the thing adapts. It will find the weak points. It will learn names. It will, according to the margins in typed pages in the old reports, reconstitute ladders, reassemble rungs, and begin again. It also meant something else I am ashamed to say I did not fully perceive at the time. It turned eyes toward me. The act of breakage named me. In a world where sunlight and bureaucracy silence things by filing them, creating a public disturbance of a supernatural nature puts a target on your back. I became, in their mind, a player who had refused to be played. That meant I would be watched by the thing, and by those who understood it, and feared it. They accused me. The agency wrote memos and sent them to people who mattered. I was suspended, and then quietly, my separation was arranged as if part of a personnel turn. I left with a bundle of papers and a box. I left the place where I'd spent a decade of my life. I do not say that with a flourish. I say it because leaving did not erase what I'd seen. The cedar scent moved with me like a residue. Now I keep the carved ladder in a drawer, press the little ridges with my thumb when insomnia hits. The photograph that sometimes shows Samuel, and sometimes shows nothing, is under a padlock. The ribbon rests in a zip bag. I have a small list of names I try not to say aloud, and yet I sometimes whisper them so they don't feel like strangers to me anymore. I wake at 3:17. I count to 13 in my head sometimes for no reason at all. I dream of deer in perfect circles and of picnic tables where people are present, but only if I close my eyes in a certain way. People do not believe me. Newspapers and a few reporters called my story an employee's breakdown, a local myth given manly trappings, a hoax. An academic once wrote to tell me how stress and isolation and environmental grief could generate collective hallucinations. They were polite about it. I took their rejection in as one takes cold weather, a thing you cannot change but must accept for now. But there are other voices, quieter and more dangerous. People who write me and say they have seen the same black balloons, the same barefoot prints, the same gaps in photographs. Strangers who call and tell me about ladders in places on the borderlands of other parks. A woman in Montana wrote and said she had found a photograph of her brother's fishing trip and that the faces had dissolved when it was developed. A man in Oregon said his daughter had woken at 3:17 on her 9th birthday and drawn a ladder without knowledge of what a ladder was. I do not know what to do with these stories beyond collect them with a careful hand. I am not a man of influence any longer. I cannot mobilize teams with radios and press releases. I can only record, hold, and warn in small ways. If you go into the forests of Washington, and I know a lot of people do because that's the whole point of them, do not be dramatic about this. Be practical. If you see a ladder in the woods, do not touch it. If you find a childless picnic and a black balloon, take a long breath and make a careful note of time and place and then keep it. If you find evidence and give it to a lab, be kind to the lab tech. There are people like Peterson who know how to hide things in plain sight, and who know how to help without making things worse. But also understand their constraints. An evidence bag is a thing that can be corrected for the public and left corrected for the private. I cannot give you the resolution where the thing is explained and the houses are safe. I have no final answer, and I suspect there is no final answer in the way we want one. There is only repetition and pattern and choice. The thing that takes has rules, weak, cruel, not completely comprehensible rules. It cannot cross certain boundaries. It respects certain momentums. It likes particular times. It arranges deer. It names. It preserves. It keeps museums in a way that the human mind tries to catalog. Understand, too, why people in authority will silence and tidy. They are not all cowardice and malice. Some of it is the slow, bureaucratic wish to keep a place manageable. Some of it is the fear of creating terror that will bring lawyers and the bright glare of courts and the slow grinding of policy. But those are human reasons, and while human reasons can close the file, they do not close the wound. I keep a journal now, the way old men keep records of storms. Mine is a ledger of times and coordinates. I write in the margins of things, and sometimes I fold the paper in secret and place a ribbon in the seam like a prayer. I have people who send me notes. A teacher who saw 13 deer in a pattern on the edge of a playground. A child who sketched a ladder without hearing a story and handed it to a parent. Patterns are contagious. Warnings are small. If you are hearing this and you feel inclined to help, don't start a campaign. Don't yell at agencies. They already have reasons to smooth the edges. Instead, note things. Record small details. Keep photographs safe in 2 separate places. If you ever take evidence that looks wrong, a photograph that has a space missing, a ribbon that vanishes from film, copy it to multiple places immediately. If you have a loved one who goes missing and the story feels off in the way that makes your stomach drop, speak to someone trustworthy and discreet. There is power in careful, repeated notice. I tell you all this because keeping silent felt like complicity and I can no longer bear it. Not because I want to be believed. Belief has consequences. But because the pattern keeps repeating, and the pieces fit into places no policy can cover. I want others to watch, to notice, to count. There will be people who will call this myth-making. There will be people who will say the imagination is a liar. There will be others who will remember things and come forward. If nothing else, I ask that you listen to your own body. If the woods make you feel watched in a way that doesn't have to do with people, if the silence has a tone that is not peace, that is not ecosystem, trust that discomfort. It is better to be cautious than smugly unconcerned. And if you have a story, if you have a picture that refuses to hold a face, if you have a balloon stuck in a cedar, if you woke at 3:17 and notched the moment on the wall, then reach out. Not to make noise, but to make a record. I have a box of small things and a journal full of coordinates. I cannot stop the thing. I cannot promise to keep you safe. But I can tell you where the seams are worn thin. And perhaps together we can stitch a little more sturdiness into the line. I'm writing this now not to spook you, but because silence has been doing its job for too long. The parks are full of small, brutal, and beautiful things, and this is one of those that eats both. I am still watching. I am still waking at 3:17. I still count to 13 sometimes in the dark, and the carved ladder in my drawer is a small, dull tooth. I turn between my fingers to remind myself I did something. If you've seen anything like this, if you have a photograph that won't hold a person, if you found a child's drawing and the child's face is not there when you develop the film, share it with someone discreet. If you have a story to tell, send it. I will collect. I cannot promise I can fix it, but I can keep evidence from slipping entirely into the white noise of explanation. If this reached you and you think it's just a campfire tale, that's fine. Take the safer road. But if my words touch you in a way that makes you check the trees at the edge of your hike, then do me a favor. When you tuck your phone away, make a note of the time. Keep a copy of what you saw. We don't need headlines. We need records. If you want to hear more, if you have a photograph or a memory or a name that won't leave you, share it carefully. Subscribe to keep track of what I collect. If you know someone who has a missing piece in their life that matches these details, share this quietly with them. I'm not asking for a viral reckoning. I'm asking for one lantern in the dark, held calmly by people who notice. I never wanted to be famous for this. I wanted to keep a place that had been my home safe for the people who love it. I failed in some ways and succeeded in others. I broke a ladder, and the thing recoiled. That was a small victory. It was not a solution. So keep your eyes open. Count your steps. If you find a ladder, leave it be. If you find yourself waking at 3:17, write it down. If you find a ribbon, fold it into a bag. If you hear a name whispered into the trees, remember that names are not always keys. Sometimes they are anchors. And if you have your own story, tell it. Share it in the comments below or in a message. I will read. I will keep what you give me safe for as long as I know how. If this mattered to you, if it touched something in your bones, consider subscribing or sharing this with someone you trust, not to make noise, but to make another set of eyes on the map. Because strange things are happening in Washington's forests, and when I say no one believes me, I mean the institutions and many people who should listen do not. But there are others like you, I think. Help me find them.